This story involves soggy fields and an angry, torch-carrying mob. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the history of the Ausable River. This is a history and knowledge that, unfortunately for the owners and employees of Brewster's mill, the angry mob did not know. Here's the Ausable River as it flows today. Its path begins near Staffa, Ontario, and exits into Lake Huron in the community of Port Franks. Though it's only about 64 kilometers as the crow flies from Staffa to Port Franks, the river snakes through roughly 240 kilometers of southwestern Ontario before making it to Lake Huron. Along the way, it carved out some pretty interesting areas, but we'll cover those in a future video.
This story takes place in the 1860s, and at that time the river and area looked more like this. You'll notice the Ausable,
which means sandy river,
takes a big turn, or Grand Bend, here and flows towards Port Franks. After the Ice Age, the river would have come out in the Grand Bend area, but wind, waves, and ice pushed up and built massive sand dunes along the coast, which trapped the river and a few lakes,
which you can see here.
Because of this, the whole area was prone to flooding and was known locally as the Drowned Lands.
Between 1872 and 1875, the Canada Company decided to build a cut, redirecting the Ausable between Lake Burwell and Lake George, which would drain them and continue straight to Lake Huron at Port Franks. The cost of this work was roughly $80,000 in 1870s money.
Which seems really cheap.
Yeah, honestly, to divert a whole river. This is a pretty dramatic change to the land here, but it opened up a lot of fertile farmland in the area.
At this point, the Ausable is flowing down the new cut and out in Port Franks. So this long section here that goes through Grand Bend isn't actually fed by the Ausable anymore. It's fed by the Park Hill Creek. The next big change to the river took place in the 1890s, when the people of Grand Bend decided to remove that bend. A cut was made to give the village its own harbor. This blocked off the section of the river here, which is now known as the Old Ausable River Channel, and this is the location of our story today. But before we get there, these last projects complete the transformation of the area. In 1955, Dr. Hagmeyer, who owned the land, had Lake Smith drained to create a swath of new farmland. And finally, in the 1960s, a dam was constructed in Park Hill that helps control the flow of this portion of the river.
Okay, so rolling back to the 1800s, none of the previously discussed changes had been made yet, so the land is full of lakes and marshes and is very prone to flooding. In 1832, a group of industrious men, which included Benjamin Brewster and Daniel Charles Pettis, formed Brewster, Pettis and Company, and purchased the land and timber rights for a plot of land just outside modern-day Grand Bend. This was from the Canada Company, who owned the Huron Tract, which this land was part of. They had a mill and dam built and began harvesting the local timber, milling it, and floating it downstream to modern-day Port Franks to be picked up by ships. The mill was prosperous, and although it was quite remote, a small settlement popped up around it to house the employees. Depending on the source, we read at its peak, the mill employed anywhere from 30 to 300 people. I'm assuming that 300 figure is a typo in the paper we read, and realistically it was probably more like 20 to 30 people.
Yeah. So who was this Brewster fellow that's the namesake of our story's mill? Well, Benjamin Brewster was known by his friends as a professor. This was because he was cousins with the famous British scientist Sir David Brewster. In his early days, he spent his time working for or alongside the Canada Company, and his name pops up a few times in the book, In the Days of the Canada Company. He was friends with William Tiger Dunlop, who we did a video on a while back, And if you recall from that video, Dunlop had made plans for a sister city to Goderich, which was to be called Gairbraid. He named the streets in this proposed town after friends and family, and you can see here Brewster Street. I'm sure the connections Brewster made during this time helped with securing the land and lumber deals he would eventually make.
Now, on to what you've been really wanting us to talk about, the destruction of the mill. You see, when Brewster and Company built the mill and dam, there was next to nothing in the area. But over the next 20 years the mill was in operation, the Canada Company continued to sell off the land in the area. More settlers moved in, only to find that the fertile farmland they had been promised was regularly flooding, ruining crops and shortening the growing season. The people grew tired of the years of devastated crops, and they began complaining about the mill/dam to the Canada Company. Word got around, and it became difficult for the Canada Company to sell any more of the land in the area. They decided to take Brewster, Pettis and Company to court to have the mill and dam removed, and also to get them to pay the settlers for damages.
And this is even though the Canada Company were the ones that sold them the land on the condition that they build a mill and dam.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it would be an airtight case, but funnily enough, the Canada Company actually won. But Brewster and Company appealed and won that. Then they offered to tear down their mill and dam if the Canada Company paid them, to which the Canada Company said, heck no. And the tensions between all parties continued to grow.
The settlers felt their livelihoods were at stake and decided to take matters into their own hands. In the 1860s, a crowd of locals gathered in the night and approached the mill site. Armed with your typical cartoon mob weapons such as pitchforks, crowbars, axes, and pine knot torches, the group quickly took to smashing anything their tools could reach and setting fire to the rest. A quote often repeated along with this story is, "After the attack, there remained at Brewster's not any dam by a mill site nor any mill by a dam site." This quote doesn't seem to be completely true, as you can see in these photographs from the subsequent decades, the dam, while not doing much, is still very much there.
So we weren't able to find any hard details about the immediate aftermath, but we do know that Brewster, Pettis and Company didn't rebuild, and shortly after the mill's destruction, they sold the property. The new owner, John Dalziel, did eventually build a new mill, but it was a bit closer to Grand Bend, and we believe it was steam-powered. We're not exactly sure the age of Benjamin Brewster at the time, but he probably wasn't a young man anymore, and the mill operated for roughly 20 years, so after selling, he may have just called it quits. The story just kind of fizzles out after its fiery climax, but it left its impression on the local history. There are a few historical signs up in the area, and even a local brewery is named after the story. You can still visit the remains and make out the old mill pond, but pretty soon this will be yet another story lost to time.
All right, so we've got a couple of additional interesting facts about the area we talked about in this video. You now know the big transformation that took place here, rerouting the river and draining the lakes and wetland. The last lake, Lake Smith, having been drained as recently as the 1950s. This area has been an important staging area for tundra swans on their northerly migration from the northeast coast of the United States to the Arctic. They did not get the memo that the lakes have been drained and still show up in the tens of thousands in the early spring for a quick rest. I can't help but imagine this area isn't nearly as hospitable for them as it once was. But thankfully, they're still showing up in the flooded fields of the Thetford Bog. And a weird bit of info we came across while researching this story is the missing settlement of Port Franks. If you look at this map, you'll see Port Franks located here. That's the Port Franks we know and the one mentioned in the story. But if you look at this old map from 1862, you might notice this block of land here, labeled Reserve for Port Franks, right where Grand Bend ends up being. Now, Grand Bend wasn't the town's original name. It went by Brewster's Mill, of course, but also Websterville and Somerville. It could have been that because the area had already been going by a different name, the next settlement that popped up was given the name Port Franks instead. I'm really not sure. In the book I mentioned earlier, In the Days of the Canada Company, there's a funny story about the Port Franks that wasn't there.
This spot had been known as one of those places facetiously termed the Canada Company's map towns, but never grew into a reality. An errant immigrant in the early days made it his destination, and as he plowed his way over plains of sand and through pine ridges, found his dreams of trout and deer and bird vanish. At Brewster's Mill he asked for Port Franks. Port humbug, was the answer. There is no Port Franks. But it is here, the tired man said, drawing forth his map. Very likely, but it is nowhere else.